kind of a wide variety of experiences and transformations of intimacy we were facing in the time of social distancing. I take the increase of media coverage of intimate life changes during the pandemic as kind of a first indicator that people experienced a significant shift and major impact of the new distancing rules on their social relationships. In order to collect data on those transformations, I started an online survey on love, intimacy, and sexuality in the time of COVID-19, at the beginning of April. In designing the survey, I draw on elements from sociology and research on sexualities. The survey included questions on friendship, workplace relationships, romantic and sexual relationships, societal relationships, and solidarity. Luckily, I became aware through social media that the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University was conducting a similar study with a focus on sex and relationships during the pandemic at the same time. I'm very thankful that researchers from the Kinsey Institute agreed to share the questionnaire in order to generate a comparable set of data for cross-national analysis. I'm really looking forward to learning more about the transformations of intimate life in the US, and I'm particularly excited that Amanda Gesselman from the Kinsey Institute will present first results from their study right after my talk. My survey started on April 1st. During the course of 1 month, more than 8,000 respondents participated in the study, and more than 4,700 participants from Germany and Austria completed the questionnaire. The questionnaire also included the open-ended questions of how intimate relationships have transformed during the lockdown. 5,600 people wrote a text as a reply, and I've just started analyzing those open-ended statements with a team of research assistants. As with almost all online surveys, an ad hoc online sample is not a representative sample. The participants were more often female than male, on average 35 years old, mostly with higher education degrees. More than 25% identified as asexual, bisexual, homosexual, queer, pansexual, kinky, or others. Only 3% of the respondents had another first language than German. 58% were living in a committed relationship or marriage, an additional 6% in open or polyamorous committed relationships. The average number of people in the household were 2.6. Most of the respondents were kind of cohabitating with their partner. About 1/3, I think this is an interesting detail, about 1/3 did not have a room or place to be on their own in their household. 4% were in a long-distance cross-national relationship. In general, 2 out of 3 respondents reported that the level of intimacy in relationships was significantly altered by the lockdown. In my sample, every second respondent experienced a significant decrease of social contact with friends and colleagues, as well as former sexual and romantic partners. On the other hand, half of the respondents intensified family bonds and their relationship to current romantic partners as compared to the level of intimacy they had before the crisis. People who intensified their contact with friends did make use of digitally mediated practices of intimacy, visible in an increase of the frequency of text messages, phone calls, and video calls with close friends. Respondents who experienced social distancing felt more isolated. They suffered from a, in their view, desolated social life during the lockdown. People who felt isolated also reported higher levels of anxiety than their everyday, anxiety that their everyday life and close relationships were about to fall apart as a consequence of the crisis. At least 3 groups in my sample scored higher on social isolation. People who were living alone, people who were overwhelmed by care responsibilities in their family, and young people. Even though younger respondents had a larger social network of people that they trust and also a stronger network during the crisis on average, they felt much more affected by social isolation than older people. So far, the results might not come as a surprise. Research on social networks has shown that the experienced quality of social relationships is significantly affecting the loneliness and feelings of social isolation of individuals. What is interesting, though, are some of the more specific findings on how the pandemic transformed intimate relationships. One interesting specificity is the extent to which the lockdown caused experiences of distancing within current committed partnerships. In my sample, 1 out of 6 respondents had less contact to their current romantic partners than before the pandemic. To some extent, the romantic distancing might be explained by long-distance relationships, or the fact that distancing was necessary in the case of high-risk groups and risk occupations. However, as the open-ended answers of the questionnaire suggest, several respondents were so afraid to get infected by COVID-19 that they physically distanced from their long-term partners in the same household. People, for example, reported that their partners were too afraid to get physically intimate, to have sexual contact, touch, or kiss their partner anymore. While some people immediately moved in with their romantic partner in the case of separate households, others stopped meeting at all because of the insecurity of how to get infected and also the fear to be stopped by the police in public space. It becomes clear from my sample that at least some people were really uncertain about the legal status and proper risk management, leading them to interrupt existing intimate relationships in a rather rigid way during the pandemic. Even though I have not yet finished the analysis of all the open-ended answers of my survey, I think that the kind of intensity of experience that becomes visible in those cases of romantic distancing might serve as an indicator of how significantly the pandemic transformed practices of intimacy, connection, trust, and closeness. Paranoia and uncertainty flourishes in a pandemic, and more attention to fear and mental health issues is clearly needed, as Ian Parkers pointed out in his talk during the conference. The proportion of people distancing from romantic partners even increased to every second respondent in the case of people who were in an open or unclear relationship at the time of the lockdown. The effect of social distancing from intimate partners was even stronger in the case of sexual relationships. People particularly reduced the number of sexual partners during the pandemic. Almost half of the respondents had less contact to current sexual partners than before the pandemic, and they significantly reduced their dating activities, even though people without committed relationships more often reported a high level of sexual desire than other respondents. 1/3 of the respondents who had multiple sexual partners before the lockdown turned down an invitation to have sex during the pandemic. However, 1 out of 10 respondents also adopted new practices of intimacy during the lockdown, particularly sexting, sending nudes and sexual videos, talking to other persons about sexual fantasies, and trying other practices. Digitally mediated practices of physical intimacy have not been able to substitute the need to experience the bodily sensation of physical closeness and touch. Particularly among the singles in my sample, the desire to experience physical closeness in person was very high. 90% of the respondents without a partner were not satisfied with the amount of touch they got during the pandemic, and many open-ended answers cover the kind of deprivation and an intense sense of longing for touch among singles and people living alone. What is also interesting is the fact that people in polyamorous relationships, that is, people who are committed to some form of ethical non-monogamy, distanced from some of their partners during the pandemic. In total, 41% of the respondents in a polyamorous relationship stopped meeting those current romantic partners that were not living in their household. As a consequence, 30% of the polyamorous respondents were afraid that their intimate relationships will fall apart due to the lockdown. In the open-ended question, some people in open relationships shared the disappointment about being kind of a surplus relationship person in the time of global crisis. I suggest, or I want to suggest, to analytically conceptualize those findings as a practice of kind of monogamization of intimate relationships in the time of distancing. In contrast to singles and people in relationships with low levels of commitment, monogamous couples often experience the time of the lockdown as a chance to reconnect with their partner. 60% of the respondents cohabitating with their romantic partner had a lot of fun and were enjoying the time of the lockdown. Many respondents reported that staying at home allowed them to intensify the closeness and connection to their spouse and even to their children. Even though 1 out of 4 respondents experienced an increase in relationship conflicts and almost 10% experienced at least one incident of psychological violence within 2 weeks prior to the survey participation, also 20% experienced a decrease of domestic conflicts. In the open-ended questions, respondents specified that they are having more time for deep conversations with their partner, now that reduced working hours causes less stress on their everyday life. The positive outcome of social stress reduction on intimate relationships and individual well-being also becomes visible in the fact that 1 out of 3 respondents felt relieved that during the pandemic, no one was expecting of them to live an active social life. Particularly people with self-reported mental health issues said they felt relieved that the reduction of social expectation by the reduction of social expectations in the time of the lockdown. Another interesting transformation concerns the extent to which social intimacy at the workplace and on a community level transformed during the pandemic. 1 in 8 respondents said that colleagues, employers, and clients are expecting higher levels of psychosocial support during the pandemic. Particularly women report that the pandemic led to an increase of psychosocial care work in their workplace. Almost 40% of the female respondents were overwhelmed by the amount of care expectations at work during the lockdown. Intimacy in the sense of experiences of empathy and care partly intensified in the field of employment relations. The extensive care expectations are burdening women who are already providing lots of care and support in the family. The digital intrusion of the professional life in the private home of many people on the one hand, and the intimization of employment relationships on the other hand, is causing worries among the population. 2/3 of the respondents are afraid that the occupational usage of digital media is compromising their privacy and intimate life in the case of a lockdown. In terms of loss of trust in society and social connection to community, I want to finally highlight the fact that 3 out of 4 respondents provided psychosocial and financial support to other people. What is interesting is that the support was not limited to people in their private networks. 1/3 of the respondents who have engaged in neighborhood support activities, for example, have become acquainted with 1 or more persons during their activities. The wide variety of pandemic experiences of social closeness, trust, and care is maybe best illustrated by the fact that on the one hand, half of the respondents said that social cohesion among the population is strong and that the societal atmosphere is based on solidarity during the crisis. On the other hand, some perceived a loss of trust in societal arrangements of solidarity. Those people were worried that disadvantaged parts of the population will be left behind, that inequalities will significantly increase, and that certain groups might only be interested in profiting from the current crisis. It is this question of systematic solidarity that will be important in the next months, as Roger Fry has pointed out in his talk on last Thursday. Isolation and loneliness are known to be mental health risks, and I think that the variety of transformations of intimate relationships among the population has not yet been fully registered. I think it remains yet unclear to which extent practices of intimacy, the experience of touch, of closeness, of social care and solidarity across different forms of social relations have permanently altered or temporarily altered social relationships. And I'm really looking forward to learning more about the experiences of social change in different parts of the world during the Q&A. Thanks.
Wow, thank you for that interesting discussion. I really enjoyed it. Now I'll just invite any of the attendees to submit a question that they might have.
Me and the 2 other panelists, we have decided that we would prefer a discussion following the 3 talks. That is possible. Okay,
yeah, that's perfect. So throughout the other presentations, any attendees can just submit their questions and then we can address them after.
Excellent, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Okay, great. I'm excited to hear your next talk. Thank you.
You can see this, correct?
Yes, I can see it perfectly.
Okay, great. All right, thanks for joining, everyone. Good morning if you're stateside, good evening otherwise. It's almost 8 a.m. here, so this is an early talk for me. My name is Amanda Gesselman, and I am the Associate Director for Research at the Kinsey Institute and also a research scientist at the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University in the United States. And today I'm going to share some preliminary data from an ongoing study that I'm doing with my collaborators, Kristen Mark, Justin Rothmüller, and Justin Garcia. This is an ongoing study on social relationships. Barbara mentioned this, and we have very similar measures throughout so that we can do a comparison once the data is collected. But our study is on social relationships broadly, well-being, and generally how being locked in is impacting people's mental and physical health through being socially disconnected. So one of the things that I was really interested in assessing is loneliness, and that's obviously because we're locked in right now, but also because loneliness has a lot of really serious consequences to mental and physical well-being. So for instance, in the literature, loneliness has been associated with worse sleep quality, lower overall quality of life, depression, anxiety disorders, more frequent suicidal behavior in the last year, memory deficits, including earlier onset of cognitive decline, including Alzheimer's, a higher risk for coronary disease and stroke in later life, and it has also been associated with impaired immune functioning in response to a purposeful in-lab viral infection. So in this study, the researchers brought people into the lab and using a dropper dropped the common cold virus into their nasal cavity. And people with greater loneliness were more likely to report symptoms. Sorry, one moment. Okay, so I was very interested in loneliness because it has quite severe consequences, and the experience of loneliness itself is quite negative. But loneliness is also quite a common issue, especially in industrialized countries. So in the US and Europe, a large proportion of the adult population is affected by loneliness, which means that they could, first of all, they're experiencing these negative states, but also these people are more at risk for all of these mental and physical diseases. So in the US, about 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 adults 45 and up suffer from loneliness. And although this is typically studied in elderly populations, a 2018 study found that 18 to 22-year-olds were the loneliest generation. So sorry, I have severe allergies in the morning. In the United States, the Centers for Disease Control now reference a loneliness pandemic among citizens. And in 2018, the United Kingdom appointed the first Minister of Loneliness to work on strategies toward carrying out social prescribing, which is where medical doctors and other medical professionals can refer lonely patients or patients who are struggling socially and struggling with their social needs. They can actually refer them to these programs, these sort of social programs that work to connect people. So we're all, generally recognizing that this is a problem, but it is especially a problem now that we're all locked in and disconnected. So lockdown orders have substantially restricted social contact, as you all know. And while it is necessary in order to flatten the curve, this has severely limited face-to-face interaction, which is typically a context where people draw a lot of their, fulfillment from their social needs. It's where people tend to get comfort when they're experiencing problems. Generally, people will seek out face-to-face interactions where you can receive support from the facial expressions, from the tone of the voice, from people providing you physical touch, etc. So this has pretty severe implications for social connection, and withdrawal from in-person social contexts has been a reliable predictor of loneliness throughout the literature. So we would expect that, considering lockdown orders, there would be an increase in loneliness or perhaps an increase in severity. So with the idea behind this study and behind the forthcoming paper is that this sort of immense anxiety produced from the uncertainty about the future because of what COVID-19 has sort of done to the world and changed everything that we know right now. This inability to know what's going on, to predict, to control, coupled with the inability to seek those relationships, to seek that comfort like we always have, is a combination that could have severe implications for mental wellness and overall well-being. Okay, so study specifics. Like I said, this is an ongoing longitudinal study. Right now we have just finished wave 3, and each of the waves were separated by 2 weeks. So wave 1 began on March 20th, 2 began in early April, and 3 began mid-April. So those were 2 weeks apart, and then now we're in the phase where we're surveying people monthly. So we will survey people monthly for 6 months, and that starts tomorrow. So right now in all 3 waves, we have 650 participants. This is a great sample size, but I do want to stress that the majority of our participants are white, from the United States, highly educated, with a relatively high income level. They're also highly liberal, which at least in the United States impacts how people are perceiving the coronavirus, how they're reacting to social distancing, etc., with people who are who lean more towards conservative political ideology, being less being less accepting of social distancing orders, and tend to be less likely to see COVID-19 as a large-scale problem. So in 650 participants across all 3 waves, we measured demographics, which for the purpose of this presentation is strictly age. Also social support, using the item, during this COVID-19 coronavirus outbreak, my social support network is ... and participants would slide a slider in the survey software to go from very limited to very strong. We also included social distancing items to get an understanding of how strictly they're social distancing and how likely they are to continue in the near future. And for loneliness, we used the revised UCLA 3-item loneliness scale. And last, for coronavirus symptoms, at each wave we asked, in the last 2 weeks since the prior survey, have you experienced symptoms that may be related to the coronavirus? Yes or no? And now we have a checklist of symptoms, but that wasn't included in the first 3 waves, so I can't show you that data yet. Okay, so before we move on, I just want to say in these analyses, beyond the correlations, the reason that we included social distancing and social support in the models is because a lot of the times in the literature, there's some back and forth on whether or not the effects that we see are due to loneliness or due to the lack of social support. Social support brings about resources, being able to rely on people, not necessarily just for social connection, but for the things that we need to get through life, to get through a hard situation, etc. So we wanted to be able to control for that in the analyses to make sure that it was loneliness and not social support. And for social distancing, we wanted to be able to control for that in the analyses to show that loneliness is more than social isolation. Okay, so I'll show you the results for 3 sort of research questions that we have now. And again, this is preliminary data. Some people have not taken their 3rd wave yet. They will still be taking it throughout the end of the week. So I did analyze these data before the final sample was collected. So our hypotheses were that more social distancing behavior will be associated with greater loneliness. More loneliness will be associated with lower intentions to continue social distancing, and more loneliness will be associated with experiencing COVID-19 related symptoms. So the first question, is stricter social distancing behavior associated with feeling lonelier? For the most part, no. And before I get into this, I do want to say that our sample was pretty high on social distancing. Very few people in our survey were not social distancing. So in terms of correlating loneliness with social distancing behavior, in terms of strictness, there wasn't a lot of variability in social distancing, and so it's not incredibly surprising that this correlation did not come out. So loneliness was not significantly associated with social distancing at baseline or at time 2 weeks later. However, at time 3, they began to become correlated, although at a small relationship, a small effect. In addition to correlations, I also conducted a linear regression model controlling for age, income, and social support, and that was significant for T3, but again, a very small effect. The second question, is loneliness associated with less intention to social distance in the future across all 3 waves? And the answer to this is mostly yes. So again, looking at correlations, loneliness was significantly associated with the intention to continue social distancing in the future at baseline and time 2, but not at time 3. So again, this correlation at baseline and time 2 were both small effects. And in a linear regression model, again, controlling for age, income, and social support, only the time 2 results held, meaning that baseline results were non-significant. And last, is loneliness associated with experiencing COVID-19 related symptoms at later waves? And the answer to this is yes. So this was actually quite shocking for us, even though it was something that we had hypothesized. We weren't necessarily expecting it to come out because a lot of people, according to the CDC and other public health institutes, a lot of people are asymptomatic. And so we would expect that, not a large proportion of our sample would be symptomatic. And that's true. So 79 participants reported at time 2 and time 3 reported COVID-related symptoms. 12% of our sample did so. So looking specifically at correlations, loneliness at every time point was significantly related to experiencing symptoms at time 2 and time 3. So baseline loneliness with symptoms at time 2 and time 3 was significant, as well as time 2 loneliness and time 3 loneliness, although these are small effects across the board. And in addition to correlations, I ran a binary logistic regression model controlling for age, income, and social support, as well as the strictness of social distancing. And people who were lonelier at baseline were more likely to report experiencing symptoms 2 and 4 weeks later. And this is almost twice the probability, with the odds ratio of 1.77. Okay, so overall, our preliminary findings right now are that loneliness is only associated with stricter social distancing behavior recently. So this may be a reflection of continued social distancing creating a bit more loneliness, or lonelier people more strictly social distancing because of a lack of social connection. We can't necessarily say causality for this because it was only found for T3 and a small effect, so it should be interpreted with caution, but it is something that we will continue to look at in future waves to see if there is a relationship forming over time. Second, loneliness was associated with a greater likelihood of experiencing these symptoms 2 and 4 weeks later, which was quite surprising and has quite a bit of negative implications, considering that social distancing and social regulations will likely continue for quite a long time. However, a number of limitations do apply to these data, including those demographic issues that I mentioned earlier, including being a highly liberal sample, being mostly white, mostly from America, and highly educated. So in conclusion, loneliness affects a wide proportion of the population, and it seems to be having effects during COVID-19 as well as in pre-pandemic times. It has severe effects on current and future well-being, and as the world continues to try to recover from COVID-19's social regulations, we might see more of an increase in loneliness, more loneliness severity, and more of the consequential mental and physical health outcomes, negative outcomes. So in conclusion, addressing loneliness now through targeted intervention is a public health imperative for future societal functioning. Thank you. These are the references mentioned throughout to save space. I just put them on the last slide.
Great, thank you so much. I think we can definitely all relate to the topics mentioned in your talk. And so now I guess we can move on to the next speaker. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Right, okay, thanks very much. I am going to I also have a presentation, so I think, I'm not sure if I can do this.
You can just put...
Okay, now it's good, I think. Now it should work. As I was saying, I think, Amanda, I think you have to deactivate your screen sharing. That seems to be the issue. Right, okay, so now, okay, good, looks good. All right, voila, okay.
Perfect, we can see it.
Okay, so let me just make it into a screen show, and it looks good. Okay, so thanks very much. Thanks very much for this opportunity. I have to say that I'm a little bit of an odd man out in this conference in general, because I'm a lawyer. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a sociologist or that kind of thing. But I was listening to the presentations of the two speakers in this panel, on this panel, and I do think that there's some synergy. Mainly, I'm going to be talking about I'll be talking about the human rights implications of the lockdowns in place, or that have been in place in various countries, and the general discourse that has become prevalent over the past couple of months about how we all have to be responsible citizens and follow the rules that have been laid out for us with regards to the lockdowns, social distancing, and all that kind of thing. I'm mainly going to be talking about Japan because that's where I live, and that's the country that I'm most familiar with. And of course, I've been doing research on these kind of human rights narratives in this country for a while. But I think that the lessons lessons from this are quite universal and can be looked at, and we can observe very similar kind of things going on in all sorts of other countries as well. What's happening now, I believe, is in many ways a Japanification of human rights, sort of a broadening of the very Japanese kind of narrative of human rights in other countries as well. And this could have, I fear, very severe ramifications for human rights globally. Now, just so you know, I teach at Osaka Jugakuin University, which is a small women's university in Osaka. It's our second city here. And I teach human rights, peace studies. I'm a human rights lawyer, and I did a lot of human rights advocacy work before I started teaching in 2019. Now, human rights are, of course, again, I'm a lawyer, so I always have to look at the legal standards, and human rights are defined quite clearly in standards of international law. We're looking at standards like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenants on Human Rights, these kind of international legal documents. Japan has ratified most, though certainly not all, of the conventions that I've listed here and some of the other core conventions. And Japan in general accepts that these human rights conventions, these human rights obligations are binding, that human rights are important, and that the country has to implement human rights. But of course, the devil is always in the detail. Forgive me if I'm saying something which everybody already knows, of course, but human rights are, of course, first and foremost, a shield to protect people from arbitrary actions of the state. So arbitrary arrest, torture of criminal suspects, political and religious persecution. This is the kind of thing that we look at when we're talking about human rights violations. This is the bread and butter of human rights. And it's the kind of thing that from the outset, international human rights law was created to prevent. So when we think about how human rights are protected, we look at the actions of states. Do the laws incorporate the international definitions of human rights? Are these laws and policies applied in a non-discriminatory fashion in a way that makes sure that the rights of the most vulnerable groups are protected? And when there are credible allegations of abuse, are there effective mechanisms to investigate and punish people that violate human rights? These are the kind of questions that we need to look at. Whoops, how did that happen? Sorry about that. Of course, there are also abuses that private citizens, not state actors, inflict on people, and you know, hate speech is of course a good example of this. This picture that you see now is one of the hate speech demonstrations that take place in the bigger cities in Japan, Tokyo, Osaka, in the neighborhoods where the Korean minority lives. But since it is states that are the subject of international law, the duty holder under international law, it's still the state. So basically, we human rights people, we're looking at, once again, what is the state doing? Are there adequate laws against hate speech, for example? And are they applied in a non-discriminatory fashion? In fact, international human rights law requires that incitement to racial hatred be prohibited. So does the state actually do this? Japan doesn't. And does it enforce the laws fairly? That's the kind of thing that we'd be looking at. So, you know, the current international system, this is, you know, I'm sort of repeating myself, but the current international system is based on states. It's always the state that's responsible under international law to make sure that human rights are protected. And from the perspective of the individual citizen, the important thing is to keep an eye on the government, to demand that it fulfills these obligations and does the necessary to make sure human rights are protected. So we need to hold the government to account. That's really what human rights are about. And many human rights are designed to make sure or to enable the citizenry to do that. So like the right to know, the right to access information is a fundamental part of the right to freedom of expression. So again, it's all about states, to repeat myself again. However, within Japan, the discourse surrounding human rights is actually very different. And it's based on a mistaken and frankly, I would argue, a very harmful notion of what human rights is. And far from trying to dispel that mistaken notion, the government actually does its utmost to promote this alternative discourse. It's fair to say that in the minds of most Japanese, the government is basically absent from any discussion related to human rights. When asked about human rights issues, most Japanese will list issues like sexual harassment, discriminatory attitudes towards sexual minorities, or foreign nationals being refused services by restaurants or letting agents, that kind of thing. So the violator of human rights is without exception, other citizens. The notion that the state could be the violator of human rights, it just simply doesn't seem to enter the picture. And because it's not the state that violates human rights, but individual citizens like you and me, it's you and me that have to be conscious of human rights, not state actors. So when asked for who is responsible for the protection of human rights, again, most Japanese will readily answer that it's the responsibility of, quote unquote, all of us. Each of us are responsible for the protection of human rights. The state simply doesn't feature. Related to this is the notion that human rights are about feelings. So for most Japanese, your human rights are violated simply when your feelings are hurt. Like when your colleague says a few mean words to you, or your spouse insults you in front of your friends, your human rights are being violated. So human rights are completely trivialized in this notion. The grave violations like torture, persecution, they simply don't figure. They're forgotten about. The end result of all of this is the idea that being considerate of other people is the answer, right? So since it's our responsibility, not the responsibility of the government, but our responsibility to protect human rights, this falls upon each one of us. We should always be kind and considerate. We should always respect other people's feelings, lest they be hurt and it results in a situation where we violated their human rights. So human rights become subjective, it's become trivialized. And it's our responsibility to be considerate and responsible and to make sure that others around us do the same. Again, the state doesn't figure except as a benevolent father figure that looks down upon us from above and tries its best to encourage its wayward children from straying too far. Now, I'm assuming most of you can't read Japanese, but this is one of the government bodies that propagates this kind of narrative and is responsible for protecting what it says are human rights. It's difficult to say how these narratives first came about. But what is clear is that the government goes to great lengths to advance it. So government promotional material and surveys that discuss human rights in Japan only list the kind of abuses between citizens, like gender discrimination, bullying at schools, again, foreigners not being allowed entry into restaurants, that kind of thing. Here we have promotional material where children are supposed to be taught that helping an elderly lady with her luggage is somehow protecting human rights. So, you know, coming from the perspective of human rights, this kind of messaging is pretty ludicrous. There's nothing wrong with teaching children to help out elderly women. I definitely think that's an important thing, but it's got nothing to do with human rights, and that's the point. However, in this kind of promotional material, it's framed quite clearly so that, you know, here, this boy has protected human rights by helping this elderly lady with her bag. So human rights is basically presented as being synonymous with being a kind and considerate, a responsible person, respectful of other members of the community. The responsibility for ensuring human rights is shifted from the government, where it should be, to us. How convenient for the government. And indeed, the Japanese government takes it even further by trying to argue that being considerate of others necessitates accepting our rights being violated from time to time. One page on the Ministry of Justice, I think is, one page on the Ministry of Justice Bureau of Human Rights Protection boldly claimed that in 2015, that claiming your rights all the time without consideration of other people's feelings is one of the main causes of human rights violations. This is my translation, it was in Japanese. In all fairness, that page was taken down after a while, but similar messaging is very common. So here we have a very interesting poster, again, issued by the government, talking about human rights. It's not really clear, because there's very little text, it's not really clear what exactly they're trying to say, but the insinuation, I would say, is pretty clear. It's this one person here with a big umbrella. He only cares about himself, and you know, he has a huge umbrella, and rainwater is dripping down from his huge umbrella on other members of the community. Ergo, he is being selfish and inconsiderate, and ergo, he should be more considerate of others and respect their human rights. This is a poster that is you know, it's part of a human rights campaign, quote unquote human rights campaign. Now, the official surveys that government bodies conduct about human rights are also the same. So the most recent national survey was conducted in 2017, phrased the question in what I would say is a pretty leading manner. Do you think there has been an increase in people who only demand their rights without consideration of how others could be inconvenienced? So a whopping 72% of respondents answered yes to this kind of question, Responses to other surveys more on the local level are also indicative. 2016, a survey on human rights conducted in the city of Ehime, which is in the southwest of our country, shows that over 80% of people believe this, that more and more people can't put up with things and only claim their rights. Almost 60% of people believe that schools should focus on teaching duties, not rights. 54% believe that people should try harder rather than rely on social welfare. 66% believe that in a competitive society, discrimination is inevitable because it's based on your ability and how hard you work. Now, it would take at least 90 minutes to take apart these kind of, you know, false dichotomies and misunderstandings and false narratives, so we're not going to be able to do it. But I think the message is quite clear that claiming rights is, in this kind of narrative, looked upon as a selfish thing. It's something that disturbs the all-important harmony of the collective. The nail that sticks out gets hammered down. I'm sure many of you have heard this. That's what all Japanese children learn. Now, I can't say, you know, whether it was the government that first created this kind of framing of human rights, but what's very clear is that it benefits from it, because this kind of narrative detracts attention from the many, many long-standing human rights issues in Japan for which the government itself has direct responsibility. So, like the treatment of criminal suspects has been deemed by UN human rights experts as medieval. Criminal suspects can be basically held indefinitely in police lockups, where they're subject to lengthy questioning, first thing in the morning to late at night, without meaningful access to a lawyer, with sleep and sleep deprivation, no food, that kind of thing, no contact with family members, etc., until they confess. So what happened to Carlos Ghosn, I'm sure many of you will remember, the former head of Nissan, was unusual only in that he was released on bail after about 100 days. Usually people aren't released until the police get what they want, i.e. a confession. This only happened because of momentous diplomatic pressure from the French government. Refugees fleeing persecution are routinely denied protection in Japan in a secretive and arbitrary process. Foreign nationals without visas are at risk of prolonged detention, often without adequate access to healthcare. The right to know in Japan is heavily constrained, sweeping secrecy legislation, and a mainstream media that actively collaborates with the government and big business. The list goes on and on. But rarely would you hear about these kind of issues when we're talking about human rights within the country. Oh no, human rights isn't about that kind of thing. Human rights is about you and me being nice to each other, making sure that we don't hurt each other's feelings, being considerate. And we don't want to hurt each other's feelings by being too assertive and pesky and doing mean things like claiming our rights. Laws and policies, that kind of difficult stuff, well, that should just be left up to the smart people in charge. So in this way, the dominant discourse deflects attention from the serious human rights failings of the government. It shifts the responsibility for human rights on us. And perhaps most sinister, it sends the message that claiming rights is a bad thing, not something necessary for the functioning of democratic society, which is what it should be. So we fast forward to COVID-19. The human rights implications of what has been going on over the past few months globally has finally been started to be focused on. Very severe movement restrictions that were or remain in place in very many countries. Wide sweeping powers that some governments have grabbed to detain people, quote unquote, suspected of having the virus. The smartphone apps that are being talked about and that a lot of people, millions of people have already downloaded in some countries that would track our every movement. I don't want to open a discussion on whether or not these measures are necessary, but the point that I want to make is that we are being conditioned to accept them as normal. Don't think that they're going to go away once this state of emergency ends. After all, like with the war on terror, there is no end. We're already being told that COVID-19 may never be overcome, like HIV, and that we'll have to live with various restrictions for the foreseeable future. And even supposing a vaccine is found and made widely available, we've seen time and time again how governments that extend their powers during the state of exception, i.e. during the state of emergency, never give them up. And France is actually a really good example for this. So within this state of exception, we're being bombarded with the message that we must be responsible citizens. We must practice social distancing. We have to wear masks. We must sneeze into our sleeves, like the WHO commercial that many of us have seen. We must do as we are told to protect others, to quote unquote save lives. In some countries, these are being many countries, they're being enforced to a certain extent by laws and punishments. In others, like in Japan, where that kind of legal framework doesn't exist, immense social pressure is being created to make sure that people stay in line. So people who don't comply with these instructions, people who question whether the lockdowns are effective, even necessary, are described as acting irresponsibly. I don't think that I'm the only one who's noticed how demonstrators, for example, in the past few days in Hong Kong, when the media shows these people demonstrating, one of the first things out of their first descriptions is that they are flouting social distancing guidelines. In Japan now, the laws do not actually provide for a strict enforceable lockdown, but people and businesses have been simply requested to show, quote unquote, self-restraint. The legal state of emergency is actually going to come to a close tomorrow in all remaining areas of the country, but we're still being asked to show self-restraint. So non-essential businesses that don't close are being trolled on social media. Parked cars with out-of-town plates are having threatening notes put on their windshields by people accusing them of spreading the virus. The police say they're being inundated with complaints about persons acting in an irresponsible manner. So like they're walking around without a mask, or they're meeting in groups in restaurants. And the police, as we see in this photograph, are also patrolling areas, quote unquote, encouraging people to exercise, again, quote unquote, self-restraint. One of the logical conclusions of this, of course, is that the people who do get infected are, in fact, somehow the people who had acted irresponsibly, and that somehow it's their fault. And in fact, a recent survey shows that 15% of Japanese believe that people who do get infected should take responsibility for their own carelessness. In other words, their own fault. Now, the 15% number is much, much larger than the other countries that were where this survey was conducted. We can look upon this number as large and small, but the media in Japan is full of people, people who have even recovered from after having had the virus, who feel afraid of telling friends or family or employers that they had been infected, lest they be shunned. Now, in different ways, of course, we're seeing the same kind of phenomena in all of our countries. And I would argue that basically what we're seeing is a situation where people are being conditioned. We're being conditioned to accept these kind of severe restrictions and also to police these restrictions vis-a-vis other citizens. Once again, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down, and we're all being given hammers with which to bash our fellow citizens. Our attention and our energy are being detracted from much more fundamental questions that need to be raised. And in that way, I think what we're seeing is a Japanification of human rights, and maybe of this kind of the broader kind of social discourse in general. So thanks very much for listening to me. Finally, I'd just like to promote my books, especially this one, which is on human rights in Japan, and the kind of human rights narrative issue which I just mentioned. Of course, it's of course exorbitantly expensive, as one would expect. So do please use the discount code. I hope it still works. Thank you very much.
Great. I think that was a really interesting talk. I was actually curious to ask a question about how you feel about healthcare as a human right, especially in these pandemic times. Because I'm from the US and I see that people are having to pay for their treatments. So how do you think that kind of aligns in your argument?
Well, I mean, you don't need me to tell you that the situation in the United States is completely unique amongst industrialized countries, and frankly, amongst many, many other countries in the world. And it is terrible. There is a very clear, there's a right to adequate health care that is very clearly stated in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It's a human right. Healthcare is a human right, which, certainly all countries that have ratified this convention and pretty much everybody in the world clearly recognizes. So yeah, I mean, the situation in the United States is abominable, and something has to happen. And I certainly hope it does, because again, there was a meme going around on social media, and perhaps you've seen it, of the number of people who have lost their healthcare from losing their jobs, and it goes down all the industrialized countries, 0, 0, 0, 0. The United States is what, I don't know how many million now. So it is I think what we're looking at in the United States is a catastrophe. It's a social catastrophe. Not only are people losing their jobs, but they are also losing their access to healthcare. And for example, in Japan, there are strict regulations about how much a doctor can charge. Above and beyond the fact that healthcare, we all have socialized healthcare. So even if for whatever reason you didn't have adequate coverage when you were in Japan, the amount of money you would have to pay a doctor is, it would not break the bank, for somebody coming from the United States or Europe. Whereas in the United States, it's outrageous. I mean, I haven't lived there for a long time, but it's I know it can be thousands of dollars just to see the doctor for a few minutes. So this entire for-profit healthcare system in the United States, I mean, definitely has to change, and I hope that the time has come.
Yeah, definitely agreed. Definitely agreed. So I think that was all of our speakers, correct? Yes.
Yes.
So I would just open again the Q&A section for any of the attendees that have questions for any of the speakers. I see that there's one here for you, Saul. In regards to the human rights discourse, what are your thoughts on other countries? For example, the US, individual rights over human rights of others. Are there countries that are getting it right?
I mean, there's no country where there are no human rights problems. I mean, that I definitely do want to make clear. And of course, there are all sorts of different, I think, narratives and that are prevalent in many other countries as well. But I think if you go, I certainly have never, I've lived in a lot of countries and I've never seen any the kind of narrative that the Japanese government has on its websites and that it tries to promote through its material about human rights. I've never seen this anywhere else. I've seen people, normal citizens who clearly don't have an understanding of these kind of issues. I've seen people talk about it in that kind of way, but the real problem, I would say, in Japan is that the government promotes it. The government actively promotes this kind of mistaken narrative, and which is very convenient for itself. So that's really the main issue.
Right. And do you think that that's on purpose to deflect responsibility, do you think?
Well, I don't know if it's, I can't jump into the sort of minds of the people actually doing it. What I can say is that, we have civil servants that are not stupid. They're educated. A lot of them could teach a human rights class just as well as I could. And yet, they continue to propagate this narrative. So, it's definitely not a good situation. And I think it's a situation that really needs to change.
I would maybe like to, I don't know, share a thought or a question if there aren't any other ones from the audience. In the past days, I don't know, I've started thinking about like the conditions for social distancing and who is actually able to follow social distancing rules, like kind of what are the psychological, if you like, the psychological and social conditions for distancing, or that makes distancing realistic, right? As we know from the HIV prevention campaigns and sex education, prevention measures always have to connect to the everyday life of people, right? To, I don't know, take into account also emotional dimensions and not only like have this cognitive plea for risk management and like responsible decisions. And in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, I don't know, I started thinking what are actually realistic social preconditions, or how can you enable people to I don't know, keep that distancing rules without moralizing, right? Because when I was listening to your talk, you also mentioned like the moralizing of responsible citizenship and the social pressure that is put on people. But actually, after the talk of Amanda, shouldn't we take into account more like the social conditions, like, for example, loneliness, right? And how to, I don't know, yeah, enable people then to, well, prevent the spread.
Yes, I'm definitely curious as to how, these human rights violations, especially in this time, contribute to the psychological factors talked about today, such as loneliness or feeling the absence of closeness, or you know, it's definitely a topic to be explored during and after this time.
I mean, I think, you know, loneliness, you know, again, I'm not a psychologist, and so, you know, I'm sure I'm going to say something really stupid, but, you know, the lonely, you know, like you said, there's kind of social conditions that enable people to, you know, be able to practice social distancing. And for example, just to, that enable people to keep their jobs. You know, I mean, I am very fortunate. You know, I'm not losing my job, and you know, the pay, I do my classes online, and you know, the paycheck is in the mail, so to speak. But a lot of people are not that lucky. They don't have that kind of situation. So again, for them, it's been, you know, a disaster, if not a complete catastrophe. So, you know, I mean, I'm certainly not the first person to say this, but when, you know, when we look at who is suffering under COVID-19, you know, this mantra that we're all in it together is a little bit disingenuous, you know, if I may be so strong. It's, yeah, yes, we're all in it together in the sense that the virus itself doesn't discriminate, but, you know, a lot of people, you know, some people suffer more than others. And that's something that I think, you know, we really have to be mindful of. And I think, you know, I would venture a guess that it must be the same with loneliness as well. I mean, you know, people, obviously it's not all up to social factors. There are many personal factors as well, but, you know, I'm sure there are, you know, people who are more susceptible to loneliness because of the kind of situation they're in. And I would guess that they're suffering more under the current, in the current situation than others. I hope that makes some kind of sense.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? I did answer one via text through the Q&A about loneliness.
It looks like there's another question for Saul. Presently in the COVID crisis accommodation, displaced by self-isolation expectations, once cross-border legislation was used to restrict movement. Everything you mentioned, I have personally experienced. At the present, struggling to get information as to what is going to happen to us from the government. I assume this is in Japan?
Sorry, I was, I knew myself. I'm not sure exactly what the question is about. Maybe it's about refugee, the treatment of refugees, or the treatment of migrants or undocumented migrants who are especially vulnerable because of this notion that they, you know, because of the border shutdowns. I'm sort of guessing that's what the question is about. And it is, you know, again, it's just, Japan is certainly one of the countries where this has been going on. It's been highly reported on, of course, in the United States, but you know, it's taking place also in Europe and much, you know, basically everywhere else you can imagine, where, you know, this is being used to justify even further restrictions on refugees. And you know, that's quite clear. I mean, it's clear that that kind of thing is happening. I mean, it's very obvious. So you know, again, it's just another way in which this is being used. You know, like I was talking about, in which, for example, some governments have grabbed power to arbitrarily detain people who are, quote unquote, suspected of having the virus. You know, I personally don't necessarily think that this all thing was planned so that governments could do this, but certainly many powerful people, including governments, are exploiting the situation and taking advantage of it. And this is just another way that they're doing it. You know, again, the narrative that foreigners and you know, people who don't look like us are the ones with the virus, and they're going to come and they're dirty and they're contaminated, they're going to contaminate us all. You know, I think most of us have seen this kind of narrative play out in different ways in our respective countries. And you know, it's just another way that this is being used, I would say.
All right. So I think if there aren't any other questions, so Tomo asked another question. As for loneliness and human rights issues in the current situations, are there any suggestions from panelists for actions?
Yeah, that's a combo question for me and for Saul, I guess. That's a hard one to answer. So the thing with loneliness is that it, and I did get a question earlier about, the question earlier was about whether or not living alone versus living with other people makes a difference in terms of loneliness. And the answer there is both yes and no, I guess, or just it depends. So the thing with loneliness is that you can be around other people and, you know, you can be socially distancing with other people, you can be in lockdown with other people. It really is the perception of the quality of the relationship and how much it's meeting an individual's specific needs. So the idea is that, that we as humans all have this need for social connection, this need to belong. And when we feel that we don't belong, that's when we start feeling depressed and lonely and these other sorts of psychological states that from a motivational perspective are supposed to make us, supposed to motivate us to reach out and create or maintain those relationships. Anyway, so the answer to that specific question about whether or not loneliness differs by living together versus living alone is that it depends. So people who were living with a romantic partner in our sample were a bit less lonely, but if they were unsatisfied with their relationship, they were just as lonely. And single parents especially were lonelier, regardless of how many kids or how old the kids were that were living with them. So with that said, I think that in terms of suggestions at sort of a public health or policy level, most tested interventions for loneliness have been tested in terms of face-to-face interaction, and the interventions are generally focused on providing opportunities for in-person interaction or increasing people's willingness or you know, perceptions of those interactions to get them going to in-person, face-to-face social events. So with COVID-19, that creates a problem because most of the things that we've tested to help this problem are now inappropriate. So we are sort of playing catch up, and that means that we don't necessarily have evidence-based suggestions for what to do right now. On a not public health level, on just a personal relationship to relationship level, I would say that in our data and other data that I've seen, it seems that loneliness is high for most people, regardless of who they're living with or who they are or demographic backgrounds, income, race and ethnicity, etc. Most people are reporting higher levels of loneliness. And so I think that a lot of times people assume that they are alone in their feelings, but right now it seems that everyone is feeling that. And so I would say if you are feeling lonely, probably whatever friends or close relationships or family that you have are too. And so I would really suggest that you just reach out and try to maintain those relationships or, you know, spread some warmth and try to get that in return. But unfortunately, at the larger level, we are figuring that out as we go.
Right. So about human rights, I mean, I would just say that I think it's important that we keep our eye on the ball. You know, whether or not one accepts that this is a major league public health crisis, you know, we would still, you know, I think we have to be very skeptical about some of the things that are being proposed by the government, by our respective governments on how to deal with these kind of things. How to deal with the current situation. You know, one of the things I would just think of, I would just sort of, that comes to mind are these smartphone apps. You know, are these really necessary? Are these things that we really want to put on our phones? And are we really going to, you know, I was looking the other day at some information about the Australian one, where the information is only supposed to go to the government. It won't go to the company that made it, or what, you know, are we really going to believe this? And and even supposing that's true, are we really comfortable with that? You know, when it's supposedly, you know, these smartphones, I don't know exactly how they work, because so far we're not talking about them in any kind of serious way in Japan, but it's, you know, they're supposed to alert us when we're near a dangerous person who was who has the virus, or who was exposed to the virus at some kind of, I mean, who is deciding this? How do we know this is all really true? I mean, this is, you know, I don't want to sound like some kind of, the mere fact that I have to apologize and say I don't want to sound like some kind of crazed conspiracy theorist, I would submit, already shows how far these kind of narratives have gone. You know, what is really surprising to me, and this was the same after 9/11, for example, is how human rightsy people, and people who are quite on, you know, or people who are quite, you know, on the left of the political spectrum, would just be swallowing these kind of government narratives hook, line, and sinker. Oh, you know, it's a state of exception. It's, you know, we're in an existential crisis, fighting for our lives against terrorists. Special measures, you know, are in order. You know, and as we see, you know, once those special measures are put in place, they become the normal. They're the new normal. And these smartphone apps, I can assure you, they're going to be the new normal. So, you know, we really have to think about just what we're signing on to here. I think a lot of people are being rushed into this kind of thing by this notion that this is, you know, this is the end of the world. This is the public health crisis of the century. You know, the entire world is going to collapse. I really think we have to be a little bit more careful and scrutinize these kind of claims with, you know, with a sharper, you know, with sharper scrutiny.
Definitely agreed. Well, if I don't see any more questions, so I just wanted to thank you all again, Amanda, Barbara, and Saul, for coming. I really enjoyed your talks, and I think we all learned a lot. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe, everyone.
Bye.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.